Hey everybody, Tom Barnes, stories from the 70s coming to you from Lakeview at the Graceland Cemetery. This particular cemetery, you can go walking in it. Like cemeteries were supposed to be like parks where people used to be able to go and visit their loved ones that have passed and spend the day with them. So Graceland Cemetery, among other cemeteries in Chicago, are designed to have that park experience with these wonderful monuments that are strewn about the park. So it's got to beg the question, who's buried here? What are these monuments mean in the whole thing? So I'm going to talk to my friend Adam, who wrote a book all about the Graceland Cemetery now for the story from the 78. All right, so we're inside the middle of the cemetery here at Graceland Cemetery since 1860. With many Chicago stories, that have been told and some still waiting to be told. I have my friend here, Adam. How are you, sir?
Pretty well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. So, Adam, your last name Selzer,
Yep.
Pronounced that way. You've written a bunch of books. Your latest one about a guidebook to this particular cemetery. Go into it a little bit about why did you want to write it, and we'll list off some of the things that we went on a little tour of our very own here.
All right, so the new book is called Graceland Cemetery, Chicago Stories, Symbols, and Secrets. I've been running walking tours at Graceland for years, and I'm always finding new stories here. Every time I come in, there's a new mystery to solve. And so I've always wanted to put them all into a book, because there's a lot of these stories that haven't really come up in decades. Sometimes the last things written about these people were their obituaries.
Which is quite sad, for some of these people. I mean, I guess, every person has that potential of happening, but run through some of the ones that we walk through, because some of them are gigantic Chicago names with kind of sad endings, where in particular I'm thinking of Louis Sullivan one.
Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind going into that one first, just since I said it there.
Sure. Well, Louis Sullivan has a very nice marker now, but at the time of his death, it was unmarked for a few years. He died, he was really out of fashion and out of money as well. But others, right nearby him, there's a guy named Emery A. Storr, who was the featured speaker at just about every political thing in Chicago in the mid-19th century. There were whole books of his speeches were published, but then people forgot all about him. He's still unmarked today.
Really unmarked today. And we walk through this about 150-acre cemetery, and we find other things along the way, including something that's kind of similar to what's behind you now we found in another part of the cemetery. Explain.
All right, well, there are quite a number of tombs here that go into a hill. You can't really see on these ones that look like townhouses, but they actually go into a hill, into the ground back behind them. There's a couple of sections like that here. They're really cool looking. They're not the greatest idea structurally, but they're really cool to see.
All right, so for the Cub fans out there, there's a real interesting one that they might want to take a look. Actually, two potential, because one has something to do with Wrigley, another one a player.
Right, there are quite a few. There's William Holbert, the founder of the National League, has a baseball-shaped monument here. Ernie Banks was interred here after his death, and there is a mausoleum that was supposed to be Mr. Wrigley's, but then he moved to California and sold it to one of his executives.
Interesting. And then as you walk through here, what are the other ones that we saw on our journey here?
Oh, we saw Eternal Silence, the statue by Laredo Taft that was built by the Graves family. Mr. Graves put aside $250,000 in 1907 money for that. Probably only cost a tenth of that, so who knows what became of the rest of that money. There's also another Taft statue called the Crusader. It's a monument to Victor Lawson, the publisher of the Chicago Daily News. We saw lots. It's especially known as a cemetery for architects. There's a lot of architects here, and a lot of works by architects. There's Louis Sullivan. There's a McKim, Mead and White. There's a couple by Richard Schmidt.
Yeah, and was that the pyramid that we saw, the pyramid-looking building?
The pyramid is by Richard Schmidt, and he also did one a little bit further down here for his father, who was the most respected radical anarchist in town.
And going back to the ones that are built in the hillside there, the ones that we saw in particular, there was the great story about properly blowing your nose. What was that?
One of my favorites, Dr. Byford. We all wonder what we'll be remembered for. Dr. Byford is remembered for his fierce advocacy of proper nose-blowing technique. He called it the hobo blow. We usually call it the farmer blow now.
And then just down the way from him, though, there's a historical one for sure in that same bank along the hillside there.
Right next to him is Horace White, one of the Chicago Tribune editors and also a fiery abolitionist. He was hauled in front of Congress when they found out that he had run guns to John Brown, the abolitionist, during the Kansas crisis.
So on your tours that you have, it takes about an hour and a half. You do some virtually, you do some in person, and that's kind of the vibe that we got. An example of what people can expect when we were walking through. Finish up with the last couple that we saw here on our tour.
Well, of course, the classic is Inez Briggs, the girl in the glass case. I was able to find some interesting biographical details about her by looking up her parents' divorce records in the legal archives. We also saw Ruth Page, the dancer. She was really interesting. She used to say that if you only did what people think you ought to to do, you'd be awfully limited. And nearby her is Bruce Goff, an architect who kind of lived by the same rule.
Going back to the girl in the glass box, though, that's one of the more famous ones in the cemetery. A lot of people go to that one, along with like Ernie Banks and people who recently passed. But that one's been around for a long time, right?
That one's been around since the 1880s and probably in glass for about 90 years now. There are urban legends about it. There are children's books about her. It inspires people's imaginations a lot.
Speaking of inspiring imaginations, back to the Louis Sullivan grave. It was done by people, his peers and fans.
His admirers put their money together a few years after his death and commissioned a monument for him.
And I think that one of the really unique aspects of that particular one is that it has the Chicago skyline etched into the side of it. I think a lot of people might not know that.
Oh yeah, if you just look at it from the front or at the back, you might not notice that the skyline is carved into the sides of it. It's really cool.
Yeah, very cool. We can spend hours and hours in here, really, because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of cemetery markers here. But that's all for the tour and reading the book. And for people to buy the book, what's the best way for them to go about doing that?
Go to adamchicago.com. You'll find links there.
And what about your tours, virtual and in person?
And same thing, adamchicago.com has all the information you need.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Adam. It's a pleasure talking to you.
All right, thanks for coming out.
All right, that's the story from this 78. TomBarnesChicago@gmail.com if you have a suggestion for a story from the 78. Or head over to the website, storiesfromthe78.com. Happy exploring.